It's about a kickoff. I've heard myself compared to this next guest, unfortunately, because y'all were you in Singapore at that time when you recorded that episode?
We were in Singapore,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Myself, Cliff Wilson, Laurin Conlin, Alberto
Yeah.
Nunez,
Oh, yeah.
Physique
Long,
Roundtable,
oh, yeah. Long hair crew represented.
Singapore, 2019.
Oh, you had to be
Go
there.
ahead. I'll let you
And,
talk now.
Alberto hit a 500-pound low bar squat, which you can confirm at RP 10.1. So, damn, homie got it done. Unfortunately, we can't answer this question of whether or not I look like Laurin or Laurin looks like me, or we're both just two beautiful individuals, because the video quality, if you're listening audio, I'll try my best to describe things, but the video quality was okay. But it's not only about looks here, okay? Even though we're talking specifically about looking better in a physical sense, it's more about what we're saying. And in
Mm.
that, I was pleasantly surprised, and you can always tell. I don't know, Eric, if you would agree, with a coach that has a lot of practical experience that tries to take an evidence-based approach with the way that they overall will assess a situation and give advice where it's context dependent. There's a lot of caveats to what they say instead of like, oh, I want to lose weight. And the person's like, tilapia. They just have
Hmm.
the answer. And so having Laurin Conlin on was a great addition, and I thoroughly enjoyed this episode.
Yeah. I think it's obviously apparent that she's worked with a lot of folks across the spectrum of physique competitors to general population. And that she therefore has a very, this has happened to anyone who pays attention, does a good job coaching over years, and doesn't just blame anytime a client doesn't succeed on them not following their protocol, and they just kind of stick to the same system and then only see success with people who can follow their system, which you see a lot of quote unquote experienced trainers who do that. And I say quote unquote because are you really gaining experiences if you only have one system and then everyone else fails and it's their fault? Anyway, that's absolutely not Laurin. She's had a lot of success with a lot of different approaches. And we had a really good discussion about if it fits your macros, meal plans, tracking, and how that's not just a dichotomy of should you follow a meal plan or should you track macros, but rather a spectrum. And she has even more unique insight than your average coach who understands this, because she actually did, at least that I'm aware of, the first research comparing if it fits your macros based approach or a macronutrient based approach to a meal plan based approach. And that was her master's degree that she did under Dr. Bill Campbell in University of South Florida. So she's not only a scientist, someone who has done research, but specifically on a highly relevant topic for those in the iron lifting community, but also is a IFBB pro bikini competitor herself and very experienced coach. So there's a lot of wisdom to be gained here, and also a lot of personal insight as she shares her story and how that's evolved with food over time.
Oh yeah, and I just have to say, Eric, you're knocking it out of the park with the guests where, you told me you're going to be in Singapore. You're like, I think this person would be good, this person would be good, this person would be good. You have yet to let me down when it comes to the guests. I think Laurin did an excellent job explaining what her research was on, how it applies to everyone, not just competitors. And that's what I want to stress, because we are truly one cult underneath the iron. And in the end, Paimon will take us all. So whether or not you plan on competing, I can't stress this enough. A lot of the insight you will hear relates to behavior and relates to adherence and will relate to most individuals listening to this episode. So I think everyone's in for something.
Absolutely well said. And I think when we try to distill something down to either meal plans or macros, we kind of see them as these quote unquote things. And this episode's really good in that it breaks down the components to each one of those and helps us understand the mechanisms of what their pros and cons are, why they might and might not work in given different situations, and what types of people at what different levels of education could benefit from either one. So definitely stay tuned. You're in to learn a lot.
Here we are talking about macros versus meal plans and why basically, I think what's happening in all these episodes is Eric is my coach and he's trying to pass me off to other accomplished coaches. And it's almost like an interview process for them to see if they can handle me. So we had Cliff Wilson on before. We've had a lot of people, even Brian Whitaker, who's more a competitive bodybuilder, not a coach. But you're like, man, Omar, at this point, if anyone accepts you, I'll take it. And now we have Laurin, Conlin on to talk about macros versus meal plans, and he basically just wants something to stick into this big old brain of mine. But you know what? I'm convinced I could get shredded on McGangbangs and McGriddles. So I don't know. This is called what's that? It's a great show where it's convince me otherwise. Basically, I'm gonna listen to the science and I'm gonna see if I believe it.
So the unfortunate situation, Omar, is that every guest we've had who coaches has turned down my behind-the-scenes offer to take you on.
Got it.
And I've even asked some people who aren't coaches at all.
Right.
Like people who are movie producers that we've had on.
Yeah.
People that are just pure athletes. I've even offered to pay them in advance most of my life savings. So I've come to just accept that we're working together, whether I like it or not.
Yeah.
And, you know, I almost don't want to ask Laurin because I know she's going to say no. But the good news is, at the very least, we're going to get a good podcast episode out of this.
Coach, one thing I just want to say is I understand their trepidation working with such a high-level athlete. You know, it's like, I'm already here. They know I can't get much higher. And so it's a risk to their credibility should I get worse because I'm peak performance. So I understand their trepidation. I understand why they wouldn't want to associate with that risk, but I understand that you also just have a big heart. So thank you for accepting me for me. And that's the podcast, guys. Accepting one another.
I think exactly. When you're working with a world champion body toner and the highest class wellness category winner, which is actually everyone in the world who's won, there's nowhere to go but down. So it's not even your fault, Omar. It's really mine. I'll take this one on the chin. It's that as a coach, you make me feel inadequate, and I know that I can't make you any better. So there's only, after every peak, there's a cliff.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And we just had Cliff Wilson on, so we're already starting to fall off it. And with that transition of me saying the name of the last guest on, we now have the current guest on while we just did the Singapore Physique Summit. Mm-hmm. This is Laurin Conlin, IFBB pro bikini competitor, a master of science, a student of Dr. Bill Campbell, and someone I had the pleasure of meeting when I went to Australia back in 2016, and I was just very impressed with her command of both coaching and the science, and just her hard work and ethic as an athlete that I think you brought into the realm of academics and practice. So if you could please introduce yourself to the Iron Cult.
Well, I can't really follow that up. Thank you guys for having me on. Slowly losing my voice already. I'm like, this is so great. I can hear it. But thank you guys for having me on. I really appreciate it. I've been listening to this since it came out, and so it's cool to be here. Even though, me and Omar may be related, that's per the internet. We look very similar. So
I'm just a little disappointed you're not wearing a headband. Let me just say that.
Thankfully, Berto left, so you guys couldn't just put that on
while
I was...
We had a secret plan. We were going to steal Berto's headband. I was going to try to force you to wear it.
Told him to get out of here before we recorded.
Look, Laurin.
Go get to your flight early, Berto, because I'm not going to let Eric make me a meme.
For anybody who doesn't understand the joke, which is everybody, a few years ago, I was wearing a headband quite like Berto wears, quite like you're wearing, Omar. And I don't know why, but my friend Paul was like, "You look like Omar." And I was like, "Excuse me?" He's like, "Or maybe Omar looks like you." And I was like, "Well, I don't know what's worse, but I don't like it." And they started making all these like memes and just stupid stuff. It was just floating around, and I was like, "Oh my God, this is so embarrassing if I ever actually interact with Omar," because at this point I had never met you and still haven't, but now here we are, and a few years later.
Well, I'm just going to say this. It's 2019. Mm-hmm. Gender is fluid.
Yeah.
Beauty standards are subjective. And regardless of that fact, you're both incredibly attractive people, so you both got complimented by that internet meme.
But that's
Omar, you look like Laurin. Laurin, you look like Omar. And you're both gorgeous in whatever sex you identify or gender with at this time right now.
Well, I was going to say, I don't think beauty is subjective. I think it's objective, and I think we're two knockouts. So, like, it just follows, obviously, that people would see similarities, and I am humbled, and I'm honored.
Beautiful. So, Laurin, now that we've established that you're attractive, and so is Omar, objectively and subjectively, regardless of sex or gender here in 2019, can you tell us about a few years back when you were studying under Dr. Bill Campbell out in Florida?
Yeah, so I started my master's in 2014, which is so crazy to think about, and got in there, and I knew I wanted to do research, but I wasn't necessarily sure what I wanted to do. And we just started throwing ideas around, and we just kind of stumbled upon this, like, hey, we should look at flexible dieting versus a meal plan. Like, nobody's done that. And at this point, I was very much immersed into the macro tracking, world of bodybuilding, because I'd come up with very like old school kind of bodybuilders as far as like friends. But nobody ever was like, you have to eat on this meal plan. Like, it was very much just like, hey, eat these bodybuilding foods. And then I actually started working with Lane in 2013, and it was like, hey, here's macros. And I was like, what are these?
Right.
And then, so I'd been doing that now for about a year and a half, got to school and was like, well, we should look at this. And Campbell was fully on board. And so the following, year we started it. So it was an actual intervention of, okay, hey, we're going to either be on a meal plan or you're going to be on macros and you're going to diet. And I was very interested not only in weight loss, but weight regain.
Yep. Still
interested in that. And there's just, pretty much all of the weight regain research is just so poor. Like, the outcomes are so poor.
It's a dismal bit of research if you're trying to see positive things in the world.
Pretty depressing. Most diets work, but then what happens afterwards? And of course, in a academic setting, if somebody is doing their master's, it's not going to be able to, the time course of a study is not going to be able to look at somebody for 3 years, right? But we did a pretty intensive for at least a master's program research, and it was 20 weeks total. There was a baseline period, it's about 22 weeks. So we got all the baseline measurements and then randomized everyone, and there was a 10-week diet. So by bodybuilding standards, it was not necessarily so crazy restrictive, but it was about a 25% deficit, which for, standard population, that is. So we split them into the groups. So the meal plan, there were a few choices on the meal plan, but it was a meal plan. Like, it's pretty straightforward. Right. Hey, eat this. If you don't want to eat that, you can switch it out for this other similar option.
So we're talking switching out sources of protein, switching out sources of carbohydrate.
Exactly. Yeah. Just basic modifications, because we knew if we gave it only one option, it was probably going to be fairly challenging for them to stick with us.
So you wanted to give like a fair comparison.
Yes.
Right.
So not too much flexibility, but also enough to kind of just work into people's lives. So that was the one group. And then the other group was just given macros. And in research, you can't favor, obviously, one group over another. So we couldn't necessarily coach them, in air quotes. So the people that were doing the study, sorry, I should back up. We recruited people who had at least a year of resistance training experience. They were not necessarily people who were, bodybuilders or anything like that, but they were gym goers. And we had pretty average weight people. There were a few that were heavier than others, but not, not overweight and obese sedentary people. So, your resistance training, and you've been doing this for a year, and so some of the people came into it and they were already pretty advanced, and some of the people who came into it were like, I'm just going to do this study, but I have literally no idea what I've
never tracked the macro, nor have I followed a meal plan. Maybe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we couldn't give the people who got into the macro plan more coaching than those in the meal plan. That wouldn't be fair at all. So we did provide them with Sohee Lee's ebook from a few years ago, just how to track macros. It was this very basic ebook. But we did give them resources to read up on. So it was very straightforward, very easy to understand. So basically that was what we did for the 10 weeks. At this point, we did not train them. We just said, simply continue doing what you're doing. Like, please, for the love of God, don't change anything.
Right.
And so we just recorded minutes, like total minutes of exercise per week. So pretty basic, but also pretty standard for that kind of research. So that was a 10-week deficit. And then, so the first baseline, and then we did 5 weeks into the diet, and then 10 weeks into the diet. So
you did pre, post, and mid.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
And then in the beginning, so we looked at all different measures of body comp. So we use both ultrasound and skin folds for body comp.
Awesome. Yep.
And then now Campbell has the body water machine, which is like so helpful, which we didn't have then, but we just didn't have it. So
you can differentiate between whether or not lean body mass is just water tissue,
yes,
or if it's actually maybe muscle mass or skeletal muscle or what have you, right?
Because we do have females in the study, so of course, like time of month will affect lean body mass, and we couldn't necessarily tease that out at that point. So we looked at 2 different body comp measures, and then we looked at resting metabolic rate. We did do salivary leptin, which didn't show anything. It literally was negative.
Yeah.
You guys didn't do shit besides spend $2,000, so that was fun. And then that was the best thing ever. And then we also did the 3-factor eating questionnaire.
Right.
So we did that at beginning of the diet, end of the diet, and then also end of the post-diet period. So for anybody who's in the 3-factor eating questionnaire is basically looking at different types of eating behaviors. And in the most simplest way, I would say that's what it looks at. So, and a lot of the questionnaires, I feel like, kind of make anybody who is semi-interested in what they look like sound like they have an eating disorder.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I was very picky with choosing.
Which, of course, we do.
Well,
yeah.
I would say competitors, yes. But these people didn't, and I didn't want it to tease out that. So I found that this was probably one of the better questionnaires to use. So we did all that for those 3 periods. And then the 10-week post-diet period was, hey, do whatever you want, but please, again, come back. We need you to come back. So they came for 5 weeks post-diet and then 10 weeks post-diet.
So let me just say, just kind of for the listeners who maybe have not been through the process of doing a master's degree, a 20-week period of data collection is actually very ambitious. And impressive that it was done, and that honestly is what you might see in some PhDs. Being able to track those variables and do what you did is really helpful. And while there are obviously longer studies that have been done, they normally have much more resources behind them. And of course, if we want to look at dietary adherence and long-term outcomes, the ideal scenario would be, hey, we got a 5-year study, but it's just not going to happen. But I will say that a 20-week period, especially with only half of those 20 weeks being in diet and the 10 weeks being post-diet, I think that's going to capture most of the adherence issues and the weight regain problems that typically occur, especially in people who are not starting overweight and if they're going from moderate weight to trying to be lean. So this does have a lot of applications to, I think, your average lifter who's in their intermediate phase and who wants to have not just a semi-muscular body, but also maintain kind of that quote-unquote beach body and seeing how possible that may or may not be from a behavioral perspective. So carry on. That's very interesting.
Yeah, so I really wanted to capture something that was as long as possible, but of course, you still have to work within the constraints of, university life. So that was pretty much as long as we could stretch it. And also I had to make sure that people would come back. So It is very daunting when you have no real incentive for somebody to come back besides me begging them. We didn't, so that was pretty much as long as I think we could have stretched it. So we did, of course, lose people over the course of the study. But it was still a decent size. And really the biggest thing that I was trying to do on my own, which of course is not things that we could publish, but was just asking people when they would come in, just questions, and kind of just drilling people, the people who were responding well or they weren't, what was going on. And again, this is not something that is ever going to be able to be published, but I can talk about it on these kind of platforms, which still makes me feel like it was worth it. And it was so interesting because I went into it not necessarily with thinking that one would be better than the other, but I was genuinely curious. But I was like, well, this macro thing seems to be all the rage. It might be better, but I really wasn't sure. And ultimately, the results showed that there was pretty much no differences across the board on any measure. The only measure that was different was that in the post-diet period, the flexible group had a significant lean body mass increase. And we went back and we looked through the diet logs they sent us back and total calories and protein and time spent training. We looked through all these details and there was nothing that pointed to showing why. And I actually had talked to you about this when it first happened a few years ago. And you were like, well, the only thing that it could have maybe been was the stress mediated response. Maybe if they were in the flexible group, maybe they had some less diet stress related. And then afterwards it was an easier transition. It's still a stretch. I really just think that it might have been a finding that we had. Obviously, it was significant in science terms, But I really don't think it had much practical significance.
Absolutely. It could just be sampling variance, which is absolutely possible.
So it's not something that I like go to sleep at night going, oh, well, flexible diets are going to help gain a pound of lean body mass in the off season.
Yeah.
But what was very interesting was that the variation within people, as they were going through this, and pretty much there was two responses. So the people who had already come into this with some kind of food education, and they had already maybe been tracking macros, they really struggled to obviously go back to the meal plan because they were like, oh, I've already been doing something that's a little more advanced. I'm really struggling here. And that was semi-intuitive to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I figured, well, that's going to be obvious what happens. But what was interesting to me was the people who had very little food education coming into it really, really thrived on the meal plan and just completely shit the bed with the macros.
Right.
It was very, very challenging for them. They seemed very distressed every time I asked them about it. And of course, this is a free living situation. So them saying I'm adherent, obviously we're trying to like take their word for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it was a malicious non-adherence, but of course when you're getting thrown into something like that, it's a little bit harder. But they really, really did well with the meal plan.
Yes.
And they basically were like, this is the first time that I've understood like how much and when to eat something.
Mm-hmm.
So, and those people still, like the people who did really well on the meal plan, there was a few examples, who lost a significant amount of weight, did really well afterwards. And I thought, oh, are you still eating on the meal plan? Because I told them they could do whatever they wanted. I didn't care if they ate on the meal plan for the rest of their life or if they just ate Doritos the second they left the lab. And they were like, no, we're not really eating off the meal plan anymore, but we're using the similar habits and we're making better choices.
Key.
So it really changed my opinion. It was almost like I coached 30 people for, a few months, which was cool. And you kind of just learned, okay, there is a trajectory of where people need to be. And it's more of a continuum versus like, oh, this is better than that. And of course, now being so removed, I'm like, well, of course, that's why. But at that point, I didn't have as much experience with coaching people. I'd only just started and been like a year in with coaching people. So it was really, really eye-opening to me. Like, okay, the average person maybe doesn't necessarily need to be tracking macros. And I've completely changed my mind on that because I think it's really a disservice to tell people who have no food education to go track their macros. I think there couldn't be a worse thing, in my opinion, to be super honest, to tell somebody to do.
Yeah. And, so a really cool aside is the first time I got exposed to this research for the listeners was when I went to Australia with Laurin. We both presented to an audience. And my presentations were around flexible restraint, rigid restraint, flexible dieting, and trying to educate people to understand that tracking macros is not the same thing as quote-unquote flexible dieting, which is a term that came out of flexible restraint, and rather that flexible restraint is an attitude. Because I had run into so many problems in coaching with people who followed If It Fits Your Macros, and then, like you said, shitting the bed afterwards, or coaches coming from an If It Fits Your Macros background, applying it to general population people who their level of knowledge was essentially, oh, nuts? That's high in protein, right? And really having no concept of what a macro is or how to track it, what it means, or how to actually take those numbers and fit them to foods. So while I think the general quote-unquote flexible dieting community would not like to hear the outcome of your study because they're like, hold on, flexible dieting, a.k.a. If It Fits Your Macros, needs to be better. I think I absolutely loved it because it really reinforced what I was anecdotally reading and what I thought was the disconnect. And it gave me a little confidence in my own presentation just to see that, you noticed that the people who did the best are the ones who had behavioral change. And what both groups had was your guidance, even though it wasn't like a complete like coaching, let me do the best I can, but an appropriate amount of fair comparative coaching between both groups. And the individuals who were able to learn behaviors that they took out of either the meal plan or the If It Fits Your Macros group, and then adapted them in a more flexible manner into their daily life afterwards and had a certain level of restraint that had built-in flexibility, were successful. And I think we could all understand this, and anyone who is listening, if you apply If It Fits Your Macros in a very rigid way, you don't develop much adaptability, you go travel, or you don't know how to track food, or you get asked to go out to eat, and that's when you really kind of fall on your face. And the idea that simply eating whatever you want but hitting certain numbers is somehow protection against that black and white mentality that we often associate with meal plans, like, oh, I only know how to eat an apple at 3 p.m. Well, that's not that different than saying I only know how to hit exactly 250 grams of carbs when I've got my food scale and I'll never go out to eat. Because then your friend comes out of town, Christmas comes around, and guess what? Both the person on the meal plan and the person who has to hit 250 grams of carbs on the button are face down in a plate of fudge and hating themselves on December 26th.
I mean, I love fudge, so if we could arrange that, I'd be fine.
I will be face down in a plate of fudge with you, and neither one of us will hate ourselves the next day, because that's the hashtag recovery diet life I'm on right now.
I'm really enjoying Eric. Like, we were out to eat, and then he's like, do you want to get dessert? And I was like, yes. This is great. I am 12 months removed from a competition and am in no way recovering from my diet, but I'm here to support it.
I just feel like I've got a recovery buddy out here, and for me, it just basically makes my eating disorder okay. And that's what the message we want to get across to the people is.
Well,
and I thought it was really interesting because when I first started reading and learning about flexible restraint, right, just flexible versus rigid, and originally, like, again, to my lack of knowledge, I was like, oh, well, this is flexible dieting. This must be flexible dieting is flexible restraint. And I kind of looked at them very similarly. So that's why we paired the research like we did. Okay, a flexible diet, eating what you want versus, a meal plan. And now that we actually never ended up publishing it yet. We're actually in the process of doing that now. And I'm really glad actually that we did, because now in hindsight, I have a more well-rounded approach to it. And even though it might be only a few sentences that I've added to the introduction that's going to be different, it is different than if I would have written it then. Because I do think that flexible dieting, as far as if it fits your macros, is a subtype of flexible restraint. But I also think that it could be a subtype of rigid restraint if you let it get to there.
Absolutely.
And after now coaching so many people, it's so obvious the people who have those issues. And it's really, I think some of the things just make it automatically more obsessive. Like, so for example, I do not use a tracking app. I never have. And I always write things on paper. That's just how I've always operated. And so for the most part, like, I kind of know the standard foods that I eat, what's in them. I write them down, I tally it up, and then any adjustments I need to make, I kind of go through there. And I found that the people who like live and die by like opening the app and like seeing those exact numbers, like even to the decimal, like add up, I think that can even be, more damaging than, let's say, like you have a general concept of how much you're eating and you might be writing it down. And of course that's still a super rigid response, but it's almost a little bit better, right? So I think that over time, people develop these crazy neuroses with tracking that might not necessarily be helpful in the long run. But then at the same time, like, there is the dichotomy of if you just are completely too flexible and have no restraint over your eating, well, you're not going to have an optimal body composition, optimal health, hormonal side. I mean, there's so many things too. So it's not to paint the picture that like, oh, just eat whatever you want, whenever. Like, got to be super flexible. Within the flexible restraint, there is still restraint.
Absolutely.
I mean, it is restraint.
There's no getting around that. If you want to be in a deficit, or if you want to eat less than you're currently doing, or even if you just want to change your behavior to being at maintenance but eating healthier, you do have to restrain yourself currently to set up new habits. So that's a good point. Now, Omar, I'm sensitive to the fact that you've got two nerds in the area of eating, restraint, and behavior, and I want to make sure that we haven't like painted some pictures that is unclear. So, as the man of the people, do you have any questions thus far?
No, I actually think you guys did a very good job with this one from the get-go. Sometimes when we had, let's say, the Science of Strength episode or a few others where you just got like Vygotsky and Knuckles going at it, talking about pennation angles, I'm like, hey, buddy, you need to slow that shit down for the general audience. I think you guys did a fantastic job, Laurin, you overviewing your study, your master's thesis, what it was about. I just want to give a quick side note, and I heard you're 12 months out from your next competition.
No. I'm 12 months post-competition.
Oh.
So in reality, I should not be having a recovery diet buddy, but I'm here to support,
She's a team player. And I might be 6 weeks post, she might be 12 months post, but in the end, she's part of the Iron Cult,
right,
and she supports my decision to make most of my carbohydrate sources come from cheesecake.
I mean, fully support that.
See?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I find that interesting, the 12 months, because I'm currently 4 weeks and 4 years out for my first show. So we're all kind of in the same flexible is what I call it. You said flexible restraint, and I heard flexible because, see, I just got tight hamstrings, and I know the importance of flexibility overall, which is what has attracted me to IIFYM, where I saw those Instagram accounts where it said, let me see how much shit I could fit into my macros. And those are the ones, the food porn. I'm like, yep, let's go with that. I was wondering if, as coaches, if you guys can give some commentary, because Eric, you're part of this gangster shit where it came to flexible dieting, and what you saw happen with social media on Instagram. And now it's almost like not a reaction, but it's taking a look at this and saying, okay, what has this become? What do you think the current state of nutrition is for, in quotations, the evidence-based crew out there? Do you think there are holes in the knowledge or application of the average individual that is at least, aware of, once again, what flexible dieting is, what counting macros is? Do you think there's holes of applications of both coaches and also clients, or just individuals that follow the evidence-based crowd from your experience and then also the research?
I've actually been both, I would say, disappointed but not surprised in my bodybuilding community, which I'm a part of, so I get to critique us, but pleasantly surprised, happy when I've talked to personal trainers working with the general population. So I'm kind of in a unique position where some of the content I make is there to help personal trainers, and some of it is there to help bodybuilding coaches. And I've kind of, done, that's been two aspects of my career. And I've sat down with folks who work with the general population who are good coaches. And I think, like we found when we were talking to Cliff Wilson, a huge part of being a good coach is just being a somewhat removed, unattached observer, being able to make unbiased observations and connect successes with things you're doing. And one really interesting thing that I have found is in the good quote-unquote coaches who work with clients who are trying to turn their lives around from a health and body composition perspective, and kind of the interplay there, and trying to get a handle on being someone with obesity, is that they have trended towards certain things that have also played out in the research. So they have definitely noticed the same observations that have come out of the restraint research, that, man, when I've got clients who are all or nothing, black or white, they get attracted to any approach that lends itself towards rigidity and kind of focusing on being, quote unquote, on the diet right now. That's a problem. And that the approach I take to help them succeed long term has much more to do with psychology, behavioral change, reframing, and giving them very, very practical tools. And there was an era, and I was part of it, I would say probably in the mid-2000s towards like 2010, 11, 12, even 13, where many personal trainers who come from being like super inside of the fitness community, who are largely learning from bodybuilders and learning from powerlifters, were themselves using an if it fits your macros approach, and all of a sudden thought we'd figured out the obesity epidemic. You know what? If we could just give everyone a food scale, everyone a body weight scale, and everyone a MyFitnessPal account, and if you understood the energy balance equation, and if you realized that insulin wasn't the problem, and if you realized that you just need to move more and eat less, everyone would be under 25 BMI and happy, and we'd all be shredded and jacked. And they came to realize that, oh my God, like I'm basically giving people with no nutritional education a plan that's based on numbers that they have no concept of or understanding, and they didn't realize, just they almost had like an expert bias, like that I'd been exposed to nutrition knowledge, I've taken these courses, and I know what foods are carb, fat, and protein dominant, and if you tell me I'm on 50, 250, 180, all of a sudden I kind of know what I'm eating throughout the day, what food choices I'm making, and how I can fluidly hit those numbers, and then simply thinking, oh, I'm following my scope of practice, I'm being a good trainer, I'm not giving out a meal plan, which is #rigid, and is not in my scope, I'm just going to give you macros. And that's well-intentioned, but it's essentially just taking like a 4-year-old who just learned how to barely hold his breath underwater and going, sweet, you're ready, I'm going to drop you into the middle of the English Channel, and I just want you to swim back to mainland Europe. And people drown. you basically, trainers killed a lot of 4-year-olds in the English Channel. So a lot of floating toddlers in the Atlantic over there, unfortunately. And I think the good trainers really started to see that they had this very high attrition rate. I was one of them. And I started to realize, oh my God, like being a psychotic bodybuilder is not the solution to the obesity epidemic, And I think once that bias went away, trainers really started to go, well, okay, what the hell works? And that was when more pragmatic, basic solutions and understanding there's a stepwise process. So kind of the reason why I talked about drowning toddlers is not just because I'm secretly a serial killer, but actually because I used the analogy in my presentations when I first started thinking about this of learning to swim. That you start in the shallow end, and then you go to the deep end, and then you go to free ocean swimming. And what that kind of looks like is getting basic nutrition education, tracking without modifying anything, so you can start to make those associations between quantitative and qualitative experiences, using things like a flexible meal template, writing your own meal plan to hit certain macros, and only then getting to that kind of typical, if it fits your macros, macronator approach, where you could just go to a grocery store and hit your macros in very different environments, and which is great for, say, traveling to Singapore. If you know how to read a nutrition label, even if you get exposed to weird stuff, you can be like, all right, I don't know what this is, but I know it's got 25 grams of carbs, and I can make that work. Whereas someone who really only is used to, say, like Western foods, they go to a vacation in a very different part of the world, they're going to have a really tough time. So I think there's value in both. Having a meal plan with some flexible options does teach you about which foods are similar. It does teach you about portion sizes, and it's probably even better for establishing initial habits, and it gives someone a solution that is much more immediate, requires less education, and has a lower barrier to entry. So in general, to kind of summarize like what I've seen with trainers is they've gotten savvy, at least the good ones who are good at observing. They've really started to realize that a good kind of template-based meal plan, not like a personalized, individualized RD meal plan, not stepping outside of the scope of practice, but examples and teaching a client how to write their own meal plan based on numbers is a very useful tool and can be part of that behavioral change process. And then what I was saying about being disappointed with the bodybuilding community is I've tried to go to many seminars all over the world and talk to people online and express like, hey, there's a lot more flexibility, especially for the goal of fat loss. When your only training is for hypertrophy, like I've tried to tell people, hey, like I know I started out not too long ago saying you need to hit your macros within 5 grams, but I've been trying to shift people to saying, you know what? So long as you hit, say, like 1 gram per kg of carbohydrate and at least 0.5 grams per kg of fat, and you hit your within 100 calories of your target and in your protein target, you can have a lot of play in your carbohydrates and fats. And in reality, there's not going to be that much variation because you're going to have these habituated meal plans. So if you swap out, say, sweet potato for rice or oats or something like that, yeah, you might fluctuate within plus or minus 50 grams of carbs or plus or minus, say, 20 grams of fat, but that doesn't matter. And I've gotten so much pushback from competitors who are used to tracking things to a very tight level of detail, and even though they don't have any rationale by which they can explain to me why that level of detail is necessary, they feel much more confident and secure. It's a safety blanket to be having specific targets. Like, for example, I said to one of the attendees of our seminar today, I was like, hey, like, if you signed up with Cliff Wilson as a coach, or me or Laurin, you would get 3 different sets of macros that you were equally attached to and you thought were the heaven-sent perfect ones. And when you were 5 grams off or more than 5 grams off, you would feel like you blew it. And at the same time, with 3 coaches you trust giving you 3 different sets of 3 numbers, you also don't know that your energy expenditure changes on a day-to-day basis. So why is it that we're caught up on this? And there was no real answer to it except for, I really like my safety blanket, goddammit, and don't you dare change it, And I've gotten that response all over the world, and I understand it because I've been there myself, but I also think that is the problem, and that is why a lot of competitors struggle long term, and they need to get a little more comfortability with having that flexibility and knowing that there is a fine-tuned place, depending on the context of your goal, with where restraint can still exist within site structure while still applying flexibility. But it requires the willingness to change.
Powerful.
Boom.
Boom. And I would say too that it depends, of course, if somebody's a little bit more of a beginner versus, obviously intermediate versus advanced, right? So I think I always teach this at events and just in general. Is it's all on a continuum. So if somebody's just starting, right? Like we originally thought, hey, just throw you to the wolves, have some macros, here you go. It's a terrible plan. We need to at least talk about portions first, right? But then even to the other end, I work with a lot more, I would say, intermediate to advanced people. Most people who are reaching out to us for coaching are kind of in that category. So for them, it's, initially we're kind of reining in the consistency. We're learning the behaviors. They're tracking pretty well. But then at some point, we do have to transition to hey, we need some more intuitive aspects. And I do think that there is a time and a place for continuing to track, even in an off season, but working that in with more intuitive stuff. So whether it's a meal or two or a few days a week or a vacation is fully untracked or things like that. And at first people really, really get worried, because like you said, it's kind of like the safety blanket. And these are people who have very good body comps, fairly good relationship with food, and, are in a place where they're pretty advanced. And they're there is some initial pushback because typically people will fail at first, right? It's going to be inevitable. And I think that that's why people are scared to do it. Because if I say, hey, I know you've been tracking for a few years, but I need you to go eat out, twice this week. And they're like, and not track it. They're like, I can track it. I'm like, I know you can track it. That's not the question. It's more of I just want you to go have a dinner. And it can be, you can order a salad. I literally don't care what you order. It doesn't matter. The calories to me do not matter. It's more of the just you're going out and enjoying something that is completely untracked. Even if you don't go out, you can just be at home. Hey, I wanted to make a dinner and I'm not tracking it. But sometimes what will happen is they have good intentions, but that will spark, some overeating. Or if you are out at a restaurant, well, I'm just going to get dessert too, and I'm just going to go super overboard, right? And I think people have to learn the hard way a lot of times, because sometimes if you're scared to do that, you're never going to learn from it. So now I have people who have gone through that where, maybe the first few weeks or months were a little tough, but now they're I track during the week. Weekends are completely intuitive. My body weight's stable. I have a great relationship with food, and that's kind of the place that I like people to get.
Yeah. And they actually learn that, nothing happened when I stopped tracking.
Yeah.
And in fact, the initial issues I had with not tracking were because I was tracking, and it supplanted my own awareness of food, and it was the only thing holding me back from overeating. But once I actually learned what it was like to behave normally again, now tracking can be worked in conjunction with the plan.
Yeah, and I don't think this is the best plan if somebody has just come off a diet or they're, very low body fat, because people are generally more, just a little unstable, in kind of all aspects.
Hormonally set up to overeat, really. Yeah.
So if you're telling people you know what, you just need to be more flexible right now. I don't know why you're feeling crazy. Well, that's not a good answer either. Yeah. People are going to feel crazy no matter what kind of plan they're on immediately after a very intensive diet, especially somebody who is getting ready for a show. That is a totally different diet that is not, even relatable to a regular one. So you're basically starved for a few months and your body is we're going to do anything to get food. I will literally lay awake at night just should I go downstairs and eat for hours? You're this is not normal. Obviously it's not, but your body is so far gone through the hunger and the tapping into body fat reserve. So yeah, there's going to be a time and a place. Don't just think you're going to wake up one day and be well, I can just be more flexible. This is a good idea. It's going to take some time, and it's going to be dependent on where somebody is. Also,
you really have to learn to eat again.
Yeah. Also, on the other side, though, if somebody has been overweight their whole life and is a beginner, or something like that, also just being hey, just eat whatever you want. That's not a good plan. Obviously, they've gotten to a certain place because they don't have a good relationship with food or good healthy eating habits. Yep. So you need to teach that first. Hey, there's going to be a little bit more restraint for a while because it's going to feel like restraint because you've never had any.
Ironically, it's in both cases, it's a reprogramming of their behavior.
Yeah.
And in either end of the spectrum, there is I would say not necessarily an eating disorder, but a disordered relationship with food. Whether you are someone who the only thing that's preventing you from weight gain is your app on your phone and a food scale, or you've been overweight your whole life and don't know how to change that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
a interesting observation, and that's why I kind of brought up the whole social media, and I wanted the take from both of you would be that I come from the background of being a trainer before social media, and I think part of the disconnect that I saw with some of the, let's just call them macro wizards, was not having the in the trenches experience of just training everyday gen pop and seeing how they respond, where exactly as you both said, if you were to try and tell someone who was a sedentary individual, let's say in their 40s, just wants to get in shape, it's like, all right, time to track macros, and they have no idea, no conception of what it means, they would utterly fail. And more to the point, some of those people that might already have potentially obsessive behavioral patterns, it might just reinforce it. I remember when I was training people in person, some of the biggest changes were just those encouraging positive behavioral changes. It was like, all right, let's take a look at what you're eating. Cool, 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 cool. It's like, here's some things I want you to do. It's like not even focusing on specifically what you eat. It's like, let's try it. We're going to measure your steps instead. So try and measure your progress, what you could do outside of eating. So measure your steps, focus on getting adequate water intake. I see your water intake is not that great. Okay, we've done both of those things. Cool. Like maybe for a meal, it's like, whatever your carbohydrate source, what do you like to eat? You like to eat rice? Cool. Whatever. I want you to take out the rice, but double the portion of vegetables instead. So I want you to eat more food, but actually instead just vegetables instead of rice. And so you're not limiting yourself here. In fact, we're just replacing options. And we slowly do that over time and then transforming them from being a food focused individual where they think for weight loss, it has to be the food that we're manipulating, instead having them reprogram to think about lifting instead. So as I lift to perform, or I lift to get better at the gym, how I'll have a more positive outcome in terms of my body composition, like shifting that over time, all those things. But when I saw it online, when I saw people on Instagram where they're talking about things like, check this out, it's like I'm eating a donut, lifting up my shirt, and I still have abs. Boom! Macro tracking works. I'm like, wait a second, there's a disconnect between the general audience, so someone, as you'd say, Laurin, at a beginner stage, and these individuals that are just operating on intermediate to advanced levels. And I guess the question I'd have for you is, coaching a lot of different individuals with what you know, the experience you have, and the research. If you're to take on a new client, how do you begin? Where do you go? And what does that process look like?
So initially when people reach out to us, they, on our questionnaire, it'll give us kind of a clear idea of what we think they've been doing. Hey, what have you been eating? Are you gaining, maintaining? When's the last time you dieted? XYZ, eating relationship, disordered eating, all this. And some people, they'll say something on the intake form, right? Or even if you have a conversation with them, you think they might be in one place versus another, right? And we saw this actually a lot this year because I've now taken on coaches to work for Team LiquidFit. So we've actually been able to expand. And a lot of people who were coming to us who made it sound like they were more advanced, after the first few weeks of working with them, my coaches were like, hey, they're really struggling to like hit the numbers. They're really struggling to, make progress. And what we started actually doing was sending out like food logs. Like I started sending out like a document like, hey, I just need to see like what you're actually doing to hit these numbers, because I know what I do, which is fairly healthy foods, within a wide variety, and enjoy things. But, you start to think that that's how everybody else eats. Mm-hmm. And then you get a food log back and you're like, holy shit. Like you're eating like potato skins and coconut ice cream. And I haven't seen a vegetable in 3 days.
Yep.
Like this is not good. And yes, you might be semi close to hitting your targets. But like, what are we doing for like health and digestion? And it just makes it very clear, right?
The energy density is super high. The mechanical satiety is super low. They're eating foods. This is something that I see. Like people are eating a lot of foods that make them want to eat more food.
Mm-hmm. The hyperpalatability is
right,
crazy.
Only thing, and they're not stopping because they're satiated. They're stopping because they reach the limit of their numbers.
Right.
Yeah. So they're just constantly in this weird flux of like, well, I don't feel good and I'm not happy and my food's not digesting well and I'm not performing. And it's like, well, so we started sending that out a lot more to clients. And even sometimes now we just send it out if we kind of get the inkling that they're a little bit less advanced, kind of just send that out initially. Like, hey, just send this back to us. And it has been a lot of reprogramming for just like basic. We're actually coming out with like a small ebook literally just for this reason, like nice. Foundations of food education, because we were like, we're trying to say the same thing to all of our clients, but there clearly is a mismatch. So we're, putting in meal templates and grocery lists and things like that to not say, hey, you have to eat these things, but this is at least is going to be some kind of gauge for you. So as far as somebody who's a client that comes to us who's a little bit more of a beginner, it's definitely working on that foundation of just their food education. And whether it is like, hey, like here's how to pair up 4 meals a day, you know, with protein that's kind of evenly spread out, and, you know, not just eating weird stuff all the time. Like I get it if you're traveling or you're in a time crunch or something, but if it's like, this is like a Tuesday at home and you're eating like this, like this is not a good plan.
What was my meal? It was obviously nothing wrong with being 2 frozen yogurts.
Yeah.
Like that's totally normal, you know?
Yeah, and not to be like, hey, I went out and I really enjoyed this frozen yogurt. It's like, yep, I just ate it and it fit. You're like, oh, okay. We need to reprogram where we're at. So that's more of like the beginner aspect. And then like I kind of said before with the more advanced client, sometimes it's teaching them how to just kind of let go a little bit. And that's really, really been a struggle for a lot of clients, but something that I've seen great results with. And people, once they kind of get through that trial by fire period of, you know, whether it's a few weeks or a few months, they're in such a better place. And now they actually can, you know, they're not just so obsessed with things. And the people who are obsessed with food and people who are a little more neurotic are always going to be a little like that. You know, I mean, I just think that personality types
it plays a big role.
It plays a huge role. Like somebody who is more neurotic is going to kind of gravitate towards that, and also just be very black and white, be very like, I'm hitting my numbers or I'm completely off. But then, you know, other people sometimes are, even if they are more advanced, they're still a little lax, and you got to kind of always be on top of those people. Like, hey, you know, there's been a lot of fluctuations for no real reason other than like, you're not really trying. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I would be fine with this, but you're telling me you want to have one goal, and then we're not executing on it because you're not following anything. So there has to be, there's always some kind of dichotomy with the flexible and rigid. But for the more advanced athlete, typically we're kind of working on those behaviors of, hey, like we can track most of the time, but we still need to play a key role in the healthy habits. And even for the advanced person, like they might still be just eating weird stuff. And you're like, we need to get back to, okay, at least 4 protein meals a day.
Right.
We need to work in some fruits and vegetables. Like these are real things that should be happening.
Yep.
And it literally is mind blowing the amount of adults who do not eat any vegetables. And I'm not saying that you have to be like a veggie head and just eat salad all day, but I'm talking like, I mean, just throw some spinach in there or like a handful of carrots. I mean,
they're gonna die of
chop up
scurvy.
a tomato, like.
Well, I honestly think that is a byproduct of If You Fit Your Macros becoming so incredibly popular. You know, I'm probably one of the first of the generation who did not have a basic bodybuilding archetype of eating before I got exposed to If You Fit Your Macros. So I noticed this is less common in women, because I think women, unfortunately, are often taught dietary restraint and what's like okay or appropriate to eat. Like I remember, I tell this story a lot. Like if I was hungry and I went into the fridge and we hadn't gone shopping and all we had was like a block of cheese, I would eat the block of cheese and think literally nothing of it. I remember telling my wife this, and she was like, I don't know when I learned it, but I certainly knew that eating a block of cheese was not appropriate. And I was thinking, like, why should a 8 or 9 or 10-year-old like child who's got this crazy energy output think there's anything wrong with eating a block of cheese? Like, maybe I missed out on some education. It's probably a happy medium, but I don't think a 10-year-old girl should be taught you can't eat a block of cheese if you're hungry. Because, you're just going to burn that shit off, right? Like, I do think we should educate children with nutrition. But, like, you shouldn't be worried about what's an appropriate thing for me to eat when you're that age, in my opinion. And there is, again, a happy medium, but that's my point. So I came into it as a skinny guy with having no pressure on my body image or my food, and just the only diet I knew was either a seafood diet or a macros-based approach for contest prep. And it left me with nothing to fall back on after my first show, and I gained almost 50 pounds in 2 months. And I think had I come up in the 90s and I would have been given like a meal plan that would have been like just a crap ton of clean food, I would have really struggled to put on a lot of muscle without like essentially farting 24/7. But at the same time, I would have had these behaviors, and then I would have got exposed during contest prep to concepts like calories and macros. And then when I came out of prep, even though I was starving, I would have fallen back on those same bodybuilding basic foods. But I wasn't eating vegetables. I wasn't eating fruit. I wasn't thinking about foods that satiated me, or accidentally eating foods that were satiating just because I ate like a quote-unquote bro or a clean diet. And I think a lot of people end up in that situation where they are advanced. They might have competed at a high level in bodybuilding because they followed macros and they did certain things, But then you look up and like, yeah, you have like no concept of what a normal, healthy, fitness conscious individual maybe would be eating if they weren't just thinking about the numbers.
Right.
And I see this a lot too with the competitors. I've been very open talking about it lately, but because I deal with mostly NPC, IFBB competitors, and particularly bikini competitors, and there's a huge unspoken pressure to stay relevant and compete a lot. So when you guys talk about, a lot of the, natural male bodybuilders, they're taking a year or two off, and that's standard, right? Like the standard bikini off season is like 3 months, I mean, literally it is like,
it's the time between shows.
Yeah. And it's the time to just eat whatever you want. And basically what I started seeing with, not only myself, but with other people, was you would do these preps. And for me, I've always done kind of longer preps, but you prep and then you do fairly well. So you keep going, you do another show, and then you have a few month period where it's your off season. But now these habits, you may be hitting your numbers, you may be going overboard, but it basically becomes this shortened timeline of like, well, I know I'm going to start prep in, February 13th. So I better just eat everything I can up until that point.
I've got 2 months of cheesecake and then it's gone.
Exactly. And then it's gone forever, even if you are operating on, let's say, like a macro-based plan. Because obviously, again, like a smart individual is not going to eat cheesecake on their contest prep diet.
Or it just won't fit,
not because they can't, but because like, what is the point? Like that's just not really a good idea when your calories are low. So I'll just eat it all now, right? So I started seeing really the with that type of clientele, and even again myself, just like compete, really, really short off season, compete. And then you develop these really gnarly relationships with food, not only from not just because of the tracking, but because of the time span and like the timeline issue.
It's all truncated.
It's so intensified, and I'm very pro, like, go out to eat after your show, enjoy it, eat stuff with your friends and family. Like, I am not somebody who like cries into like a bowl of oatmeal after a show. Like, I think that's ridiculous. Personally, I enjoy food and I enjoy celebrating with people.
Mainly because you already made the oats with water, and the additional tears are just not necessary.
Wet carbs.
I mean, it's going to be a little soupy.
Wet carbs, as we learned from
who likes soupy, oatmeal. But I think that it's really important to be able to go out and do that, right? But then when that turns into a problem because okay, I'm off season now, but I got a little too fat, so I might as well just compete again. And that has become this huge perpetual dieting issue. And that's regardless of, nobody's protected by it, regardless of if you do a meal plan or macros. It's more of just this mindset of like, I got to stay relevant, I got to keep doing this. But your relationship with food is really dwindling. And people really stop learning how to live outside of prep. And this is of course, an extreme example with only a small part of the population listening, but it is very relevant for most everybody who's been in that. So pretty much you learn to live your life through the prep lens of like, well, I'm going to either hit my numbers spot on, or it's a free for all and everybody watch out at the buffet. And that's going to be how it is for a few months. And then now that I'm pretty fat, I guess I'll prep again, because that's the only way to get it off.
I love what you said there, because you basically highlighted that the problem is independent of whether or not someone's on a meal plan or on macros. It's because of the pressure of the sport and the supplanting of your own actual needs with food, with being just kind of a slave to not even the competition schedule, but the perception of your necessity to be always competing. And then the only solution you having to being overweight because you're always competing is to keep competing. So it's just being handcuffed to the sport that's the issue, not whether or not you're hitting numbers or following a piece of paper to do it.
It's really, it's so prevalent now, because I go to a lot of the shows. I've competed for years, and I've also go now to most of the national shows with my clients. And, you see the same people. You see the same people posting on social media, and you just see over time, they just wither away in a not good way, right? Like, it's not like they've just gotten leaner and they look better. Like, you can just tell, you're like, oh, here she is again. And it's really just sad, because I've been there. I've been there where you're like, well, I got to compete, I got to stay relevant, I got to look lean. Nobody likes pictures unless you're in a bikini update 10 weeks out. People get behind that because they like to see the challenge that you're going through. They're like, oh, we'll get behind you. And then when you lose that, and then no longer people are like, oh, you look so good, or like, oh, when's your show? Like, how are things doing, girl? Like, because that is literally what happens.
So really, Laurin, what you're describing is that these competitors are kind of trapped by the competition cycle, and that is it doesn't really matter what way they're tracking if that's kind of the paradigm they fall into, and that social media only makes it worse.
Yes, it just magnifies everything because everybody can see it, and everybody can kind of see the rise and the fall, and it's so interesting even when you maybe have fallen, for lack of a better term, right? And you've fallen off, and you maybe gain more weight than you would like to, and people really get behind you still with that, but it's still it's still feeding into it, right? Like if you're posting like, hey, like, I fell off my plan for the past few months, I gained more weight than I would have liked. People are very sympathetic to that, and they want to get behind you, but that still reinforces the like I guess I should get back on stage, and people are rooting for me, and it becomes this obsessive thing. And for anybody listening who is in this position where they are maybe a bikini competitor, what the standard used to be like, this is the easy division, what I mean, and this used to be the attainable, healthy division. And when it first started, it was very different than it is now. If you look at 2009 when they had the first bikini classes starting to now, 10 years later, it is completely different. I have clients who have capped shoulders and glute striations when they move, and those are the people who are doing well. It's not like it's out of control. And of course the density is different. They're not the same size as somebody who does figure, but if you were to look at the pictures and you were to look at what it used to be, and even when I from 2009 to then when I turned pro in 2014, I remember people making a side by side and going, oh, look at the difference in 5 years, like I was like the muscular girl or whatever. And now if you were to, put my picture next to whoever's going to win this year, 2019, 5 years later, it's not even same look. Of course, the change from 2014 to 19 is different than it was from 2009 to 2014, but it's still very, it's just way different. So no longer is bikini this super attainable look anymore to just be able to compete year round. And that's what basically ended up happening. And there's a lot of reasons, other issues too with it, but that just creates this really weird situation where people feel like this trapped feeling like I need to compete in order to keep my relationship with food and my body in check. Like it's the only way that they feel like they can keep their physique in check.
Right.
And then there's, then you can only do that for so many years before your body goes, we're done. And no matter what you do or what you say, we're not getting leaner.
I shall not cooperate. Yeah, absolutely.
This is it sounded like the perfect maelstrom here of things just stacking on top of one another, where you have societal expectations for women, then you have the pressure to feel relevant on social media, the need for validation, which comes from how you look, which is further reinforced to keep you competing, and then, as you said, being unable to take time off, and you feel bad when you go off of your plan. So there's all this pressure, which means there's an increased likelihood for you to slip up, and then when you slip up, you feel even more guilt, and then from perpetually dieting, you just end up looking probably worse and worse year after year, and you're trying harder, you're grinding out more, but you're getting less results, and it's living in this fear. Laurin, maybe because I relate to Eric in the sense where he said, we grew up with no pressure, like no body image pressure. I do think that males experience some body image pressure, but nowhere near to the extent of women. And I was much like Eric, where I'm like, I'm playing games or I'm sports. It's like, oh, what's in the fridge? Cool, I'm gonna eat that. So I didn't grow up with the societal expectations, and then forming those habits were easier because no one was looking to me like, oh, like that guy needs to lose 10 pounds. Like if he lost 10 pounds, he'd be great, right? There's not that pressure. So maybe for our overall audience, can you explain or go into a little bit of detail the female side of bodybuilding, competing, just in general lifting, and maybe some of the pressures or obstacles, pitfalls that are faced on that side that a general audience just might not be aware of? Because you eloquently went into it already a little bit with competition with that niche of NPC bikini, but in general, working with a ton of clients, what are some of those pressures or expectations or obstacles that people might not be aware of?
So I think that and you did a really great job of talking about this in that paper recently, was like who is drawn to this kind of stuff, right? And the predispositions of people. So I think that really gives us good insight as to kind of how people handle things. So most people who are drawn to such rigid things like bodybuilding or just like body image, disordered eating, whatever it might be, are very neurotic, are very perfectionist, very obsessive. And I know for me, for example, like I grew up with an eating disorder, like started dieting, restricting, I wouldn't say dieting, but when I was like 8, like found food labels, found a measuring tape and was like, I can get smaller. And there was no necessarily pressure from other people. It was just, I was a bigger girl than a lot of I had a lot of petite friends. So I was like, well, I'm bigger and I should be their size. And then it eventually turned into like, I'm just gonna eat a little bit less, to like a full-blown eating disorder for many years into adolescence, and very obsessive tendencies, like couldn't leave the house without doing 500 sit-ups and things like that. I had to drink 3 water bottles before I could have lunch, and I was 11. You know what I mean? Like not normal. So coming out of that, obviously going to therapy and getting more normalized, when I found bodybuilding, when I was about 18, I was like, this is really cool, and immediately people who were close to me were like, is this another eating disorder? Because there wasn't as much information then. And I was like, well, I can't just starve myself because then I'll lose all my muscle. And that was really like my reasoning behind it, which was a good reason. I mean, theoretically. So I think for me, it was not just for me, but for a lot of people, it can be a healthy coping outlet for maybe if they have had eating disorders or body image issues in the past. But I do think that if you're not careful with it, it will exacerbate it in a different way. So I think that once you've had those kind of tendencies, it's kind of like people who smoke always want to smoke even if they've given it up. I mean, I've heard that from a lot of smokers.
Like once an addict, always an addict kind of thing.
I would kill for a cigarette even if they haven't had one for 20 years. You're like, whoa. So I think the same thing with people who've had some kind of disordered eating relationship. It can spring into different things, but it all kind of turns out to be the same issue. And even if it doesn't, it might transcend eating disorders and now you're a workaholic or something like that, right? Sure. It can be something along the same lines. But I think a lot of people, a lot of females particularly, get into it because they've either had this background, and for some people it can be really positive because like, hey, I overcame this and I use this as a tool for strength, instead. But then it can really ignite a lot of the issues as well, especially if people are tying their self-worth to how they look, which is very easy when you start looking really good, right? So
and getting rewarded for it.
Yes.
Literally
getting rewarded for it. But even just like in the gym, or you go see friends or whatever, and say you've been dieting and now you have your shoulders look a little nicer, like in your tank top, or like you have some ab cuts, right? And because it's so dramatic, people are like, oh, you look great, and you get all this positive feedback. Whereas like now I walk around and nobody's like, oh, you look at your stomach without abs, that looks amazing. Like, nobody's saying that, you know what I mean? And not they're not trying to be rude, but those same people, like if I was 15 pounds lighter, they'd be like, oh, you have like some outline of abs, like that looks great. And so I think that for me, I've been in a position long enough to where I know, like, okay, you can't rely on other people's opinions. But I think a lot of people are not there yet. Right. And I think a lot of people will use that outside feedback as that like addiction, like it starts that addiction.
Like they probably come from a place of they aren't great at supplying that kind of thing for themselves. So they look for it externally, which is a problem in and of itself, but it's going to take different forms. But it's really interesting how you said, I appreciate you sharing your own history with disordered eating and the struggle you've had and the way you've come around to it. Because we've talked a lot about how bodybuilding cannot be simply classified as good or bad. And that you're saying, hey, depending on how you do it and who and what aspects of it you capitalize on or focus on or get obsessed with, it can be both positive or negative. Like what I heard you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that bodybuilding was probably the first time you ever actually wanted to be and tried to be bigger than actually trying to make yourself smaller.
For sure.
And I see that. I don't know. I hear that and I hear like, fuck, that's empowering, But at the same time, it is another process by which you're delving back into stuff that you had to be in therapy for as a child. And so I almost wonder, is it worth it? And like you're saying, like it'd have to come out in some way. It's not going to just go away, right?
You have to manage it some way. So you can either manage it in a healthy way, or it can trickle into other things in your life. And I think that you have to be self-aware enough to know kind of what path you're going to go down. And I've tried to learn a lot more about, just kind of personality in general and just being more self-reflective. And it's very easy now to see like, okay, if I let myself kind of go, Jordan Peterson always uses this example, like, okay, if you like imagine yourself like a few steps removed from like the worst part of you and like the worst parts of you, like where would you be if you let those parts overtake you? And it's you know, and then so once you know how low you can go, not in the dancing way,
right? So we're talking about
yeah.
getting a bar out, you know, Caribbean dance. We're doing
Jordan Peterson is doing that.
Absolutely, yeah. We're trying to get under. Got it. I'm with you.
So once you're like at that low place, okay, now you can, when you are working up, you can see, you know, I don't want to go here, right? Because you actually know the depths of where you could be. So it's very easy for me now to be self-reflective, to say, okay, if I let obsessive tendencies override me, like these are the things that could happen. And I think a lot of people haven't done that introspective work. And not to say that I don't ever fall into those things. Like I'm clearly like far from, you know, perfect in that area. But I think it's scary for a lot of people to like actually analyze where their negative tendencies and their obsessive tendencies will lead them.
Well,
you're
kind of talking about basically stoicism, right? So Stoic philosophy, you're assessing, all right, what's the worst case scenario? What am I really scared of? Yeah. And it's exposure therapy. You're like saying, here's as bad as it could possibly get. All right, well, I'm not dead. In some cases, you might be in this scenario, but at least you know that's where it could be. Yeah. And it gives you like at least a plan to work back from and away from. And it gives you a direction, I guess.
Direction to aim the opposite way.
Right.
So I don't know if that answered what you asked in any capacity. But...
I think it did. I just want to make a quick note that I find it fascinating, the difference in analogies used by both of you, where Laurin's talking about, you know, a bar and like maybe like dancing, and Eric made the analogy of dead children floating in the English Channel. So just everyone has their own way of describing things, and I just find it interesting.
Well, who do you want to party with, though? Do you want to be, you know, like in the Caribbean drinking like a Mai Tai and then a group of people all having a great time trying to get under a bar? Or do you want to murder a bunch of toddlers and throw them in the water? I'm just saying, who do you want to party with?
We're going to do a poll when this comes out.
Right? Look, I think an Instagram
What
poll.
do they say? Plan for the worst so the best can happen. And that's what Eric's trying to do. Stoicism 101. I do think that sometimes people have too myopic of a view of things where, as you were saying, kind of, Eric, good or bad, right? Like, is bodybuilding good or bad? And people want simple answers to complex problems or ideas where you have to consider it for the person. And that's what you talk about, informed consent. And I love it. A question I have then for you guys, because when you were describing the block of cheese, Eric, it made me think of someone who I was helping with their eating behaviors. They wanted to have a more favorable body composition. So I'm like, cool, okay, let me take a look. Just have a food journal for the week. Cool. They do the food journal, and I'm looking at this person, and she has like these Scooby-Doo snacks and not a single vegetable in sight for a week. And I'm wondering to myself, how are you not dead right now? So a question for both of you guys as coaches would be, if we can agree there's a certain hierarchy, nay, a pyramid, a muscle and strength pyramid, one would say. I would say I personally would release, in keeping with my theme, your pyramids, I'd release the muscle and strength ziggurats would be mine. So we would just each has their own structure. It still forms basically a pyramid-like shape. But if we can agree, if we can agree that there's an ascending hierarchy towards more positive behavioral patterns, eating behavioral patterns, what would it be? Like, how would it look like for you guys? I understand that there's personality plays a huge role, the flexibility, rigidity kind of spectrum. But if you're trying to educate someone over time, let's say a client, where do you start and where are the more advanced levels? So how do you proceed from beginner intake to more advanced levels throughout a period of years, let's say?
Absolutely. I'll start, and I think I'll make more of an observation and just point out how important these systems are, rather than going really deep into the system, because I think I'd love to hear from Laurin. But I think the like you said, people love a simple solution, and people want that. And man, how nice is it that you get to say, I'm hashtag doing flexible dieting by going on a website and just putting in someone's like sex, age, estimated activity level, and hitting click, And after you selecting, I want the 40-40-30, or do I want the high carb or the low fat, and then you can just spit out an answer to someone. These three numbers are going to be your solution. I understand the attractiveness of that. I understand how you're also being told that that's within your scope of practice because you're educating them about nutrition, not giving them a meal plan. And I understand that you're also hearing this is a flexible diet, and I understood why it took off. But I also understand why, as an example, precision nutrition has become just a meteoric success and has risen to the top, because I think that whole If It Fits Your Macros approach was a complete failure when applied to the general population. It pretty much only worked among a whole bunch of obsessive competitors who already had the mindset for it, the background of the education, and goals that required restraint. Because the average person, the reason they fail is because they think they need restraint, but you can't live with restraint. You need restraint to get shredded. You need restraint maybe initially to develop habits. But if you're following a diet, quote unquote, instead of having a lifestyle change, and every day requires restraint, even a little bit, it is literally just a ticking clock of when you're going to slide off and regain weight. And as an example again, so what precision nutrition did is essentially created a behavioral focused nutritional education system. It teaches portion sizes using something you can always take with you, like your fist, your thumb, understanding like servings of meat, vegetables, and it's saying, hey, eat this many meals, and this much of your plate should be this much of your plate should be this. It teaches you to eat vegetables, fruits, lean meats. It gives you lists of foods, and it gives you a system for controlling portion size and developing habits, and it's all behavior and habit based. And man, it's probably had faster success than I've seen of any nutrition-related certification in my entire tenure as a trainer or being involved in the fitness industry. And it also seems to be pretty successful as far as working with clients. And I think that's a really good example of where If It Fits Your Macros does not serve the general population. So really quickly to give my answer to your question, I think the system, having one is important, and having it be logical makes sense, and I think that's why precision nutrition filled that niche gap. What I normally do is I do start with tracking, but the tracking is purely there to do two things. One, educate the client so they can actually look at food labels and understand which foods do what, and then two, understand their current eating behaviors. So they're not being asked to modify anything, they're still eating by their basic hunger and desires, but they all of a sudden are getting ingrained mindfulness. So they're realizing, I actually am going to write down the fact that I had a third trip to the donuts that are sitting there at work. I'm actually going to have to write down the fact that I got up in the middle of the night and ate cookies. That might change behavior in and of itself, but at the very least, it ingrains mindfulness and it teaches those nutrition skills. Sometimes people lose weight from that straight away. And it teaches me things as a coach. If they don't lose weight and they're just living their life, they don't see anything wrong with what they're doing, which is fine. I don't want to teach them their diet is good or bad, but it does tell me about what they're doing. Are they mindlessly eating and eating things that they wouldn't actually want to eat based on their goals, and just being aware of it makes a change, because that's a great tool? Or are they needing of education and behavioral change because, I tracked it. What's wrong with that? I ate a large pizza. That might not be the most satiating thing. We could get half a pizza and a salad, and we might get some better results, that type of thing. The next step after that is that I ask them to take their current diet and we make some small modifications, and I basically have them lead a meal plan writing session. So I'm not writing them a meal plan. I'm helping them go, here are our targets, here are our goals. We want to get more fruits, more vegetables, higher protein, a consistent eating pattern. But what foods do you like to plug that into? And it gives them agency. So we go from tracking for learning and understanding themselves and understanding basic nutritional education, a client-led meal plan-based approach, and from there, then we deconstruct it and understand the macros to give them the flexibility for travel. And then after that, they're pretty much on their way to go kind of free ocean swimming. So that's what I do, but that's not necessarily the best thing. I think we've been shown that a system at all that takes into behavior can be very effective. So anyway, Laurin, take it away.
Yeah, I think having kind of I don't want to call them rules, but just basically like, hey, daily habits are easy things to stick to, right? So I find that the biggest thing that people who are first starting out struggle with is protein. And I think we all know that. And there's obviously a lot of benefits to having a higher protein diet, especially if somebody is eating very little protein. So just having kind of these, suggestions or habits, I don't want to call it hard rules, but things like that.
Structure.
Hey, yeah, we need to have 4 protein meals a day. And literally finding out where their pitfalls are English, is really the most important thing to me. So if somebody is making 3 trips to the donuts, why did you do that? Is that because you skipped lunch? Is that because you didn't sleep well the night before? Is that because you haven't drank any water today? So really kind of reverse engineering like what their pitfalls are. And that can go for advanced people as well. I mean, everybody's going to have their own pitfalls. So really figuring out, okay, hey, we need to have protein at least 4 times a day. And that can be like, I think a lot of people, when they're starting out, they think that it needs to be super elaborate. It's like, hey, have 2 scoops of protein powder and an apple. We're good. Like, that's literally it. Like, it doesn't have to be something so complex that you have to, stress out about and like perfectly measure out and prep and whatever. So it's making it easy on people, giving them suggestions that are going to fit into their lifestyle. Because if they're like, hey, the pitfall is I'm really busy and I don't have time, so I skip meals, but then I end up eating the donuts at work. Right. Well, okay, put 2 scoops of protein in your shaker cup and have an apple, and this won't happen. So we're really just kind of filling in those gaps for whatever pitfalls there are. So that would be kind of the basics as far as starting somebody out. Like, we need to have protein. We need to have kind of systems to figure out what they're struggling with. And then, getting in fruits and vegetables. I never thought that would have to be something that I'd have to really talk to people about. I will say, when we do travel, we talked about this earlier, it is hard to get fruit. Yep. For whatever reason, like, you can usually get vegetables, but it is fairly harder to get fruit, which is why I always travel with just like greens and reds powders and just things like that, just like a backup. But, so just in your general life, making sure you're getting fruits, making sure you're getting vegetables, and, eating real food. I think that people, to one point, I'm going to say, hey, get more convenient options. But to the other point, at some point, convenient options need to not be the first line of defense, and we need to actually eat some real food. And I'm so surprised also at that, how some people just don't eat like adults, in my opinion. You're not eating like a meat or a fish or whatever it is, or for breakfast you're eating this like weird concoction of stuff that it adds up, but it's like, is that really going to set you up for the day? To like, I know that if I eat like some weird stuff for breakfast, like the whole rest of the day I'm just craving food. And I don't know if that's a hyperpalatability thing or if that's for me, but like if my breakfast is like too sweet and too processed, it's game over. All day I'm thinking about just eating junk food, instead of if I wake up and I have like eggs and toast and some berries and a cup of black coffee, like we're good. Yeah. So it's kind of figuring out those pitfalls for people. And even as they get more advanced, like that's kind of what we need to transition to, is like, okay, where are you really struggling here? Like, is it because I said go have an untracked meal, now you come home and raid the cabinet? Okay, well, why is that? Are we not eating enough during the week? Are you really stressed out? Are you not managing things properly? What does your sleep look like? So any of these systems come down to the communication with the client and like what are their current struggles. And so I think that if somebody's listening who is a coach, whether they are online or a personal trainer, is figuring out what questions you need to ask, and getting that information out of them and making sure that like they are open to talking with you about it, instead of just being like, oh, not hitting my numbers, I don't know why, and they just kind of like shut down. It's like, no, I need to know these reasons. So part of it is just asking the right questions up front, but then also part of it is explaining to them like, no, I'm here to help, and we need to work through your actual issues. And I have clients who, like, every week it comes down to like, yep, and they all know that like, I know what you're gonna say, and they just have trash sleep and they just don't care. And I know that there's some people who can sleep a little bit less than others, but in general, getting pretty consistent sleep has been shown to really be helpful on a lot of levels, right?
Absolutely.
Like so many levels, and people just completely ignore that, or just like water, and that affects digestion so much. So people who are chronically, maybe constipated, and you look at their water log and it's, I had half a gallon of water. Okay, well, it's summer and you're sweating and you work out and you're having half a gallon of water. That might not be enough if we're having all these issues, right? So it's just kind of simple stuff like that you wouldn't think that maybe somebody who's more advanced would need help with, but they do. So, and it wasn't until I started asking those questions to then be able to reverse engineer what they really needed. Sometimes it comes down to the diet, but sometimes it comes down to like those other factors as well. Well, for the more advanced people.
Totally. Yeah.
I think you guys nailed it. I think I am finally, I said 4 years out from my first show. I think I'm now 3 years and 10 months, Yeah.
Omar, I'm so proud of you. Over the last 2 podcasts, you shaved off more than a full 3 years from your contest prep timeline. I mean, to get 3 years of dieting done in 3 hours,
pretty impressive.
That
might make me I might coach you based on that. I mean, that's qualms for me coaching you.
I think I can finally give you the coach you deserve.
Yeah. The coach that I look
anyone
like.
but me. Absolutely. Yeah. You know, I think you're going to have a better coaching relationship. You know, we had Cliff on, and he was talking about how visually you can see some certain differences and things among people. So I think if you look like your coach, it's kind of like if you look like your dog.
Yeah.
You know, owners and dogs, they look the same. You're probably going to be a better owner. You're going to treat that dog with the respect it needs. I just simply don't respect you, and that's a problem. But I know
it's a problem with yourself, but we're working on it. Eric, what do they say? Birds of a feather win NPC
better.
Bikini Championship. So here we come. Okay. Yeah, and that's what I was going to say is that, you know, really my timeline is just based upon the fact that I'm waiting for that body and wellness category to come up in bodybuilding where
2020
everyone's a winner. Like when I step on stage, you just get a round of applause. No one's better than anyone else. I don't even have to get tanned. Really, dieting means for me eating into the show.
Eating up without dieting first.
Yeah, and that's
my favorite.
I'm gonna use my full artistic license with my posing to not pose, but just be out there setting the vibe. You know, probably in a pair of Levi jeans. You know, and then
no tan.
No,
don't tan.
Yeah, and I would ask them to introduce me as the Pale Prince of Body and Wellness.
The Pale Prince, I love it. I honestly feel like this competition you're doing, when you send in your entry fee, they should just mail you a trophy.
Yeah.
And like, it says first place for all on it.
Yeah.
And then it's optional to show up.
Right.
You know what? No pressure. You don't have to get on stage. What if you're introverted?
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
We don't discriminate.
And
ironically, there really is a wellness division.
Oh, we know.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm not sure if you guys know.
It's coming, and it's not that bad.
No,
it's actually
or good, depending on how you look at it.
I mean, it's very.
Lauren, what are your thoughts?
So honestly, I don't know many people who look like that unless you're like from South America. Like literally, the girls all have very, very large, thick legs. They have pretty standard bikini upper bodies, but their legs are they're just thick girls, you know what I mean? And they're in shape though. It's not like they're out of shape. So I think a lot of people see the size and they're like, oh, maybe they're not in shape. But if you're looking at the photos of the girls that they're using, you can go to NPC News and see the rules. I mean, they got some legs, and it's going to be interesting to see what they do over here because it's obviously it started in South America. It's a very big division in South America, and I understand why they're doing it because IFBB and NPC have really expanded into international shows, but it's going to be very interesting what it looks like outside of maybe Miami.
Yeah, the issue I have with this is the entire concept of competing in wellness. That the name is a problem for me.
But I thought maybe it was like a language thing. That's what I was thinking.
Maybe it could be. It's very possible that there's a certain wording used in either Portuguese or Spanish that doesn't translate well to English. But in English, the idea of competing in wellness is kind of like so classically American and messed up that I just expected it came from us, but maybe not.
No, it didn't. It's very well rooted over there, and it's their most popular division, from what I understand for the females. But so that's why I think people were like, oh, I think that's where the confusion was, and it has a long lineage of people competing in it, and now they're just basically bringing it over here. So I think it's going to be kind of the Wild West the first year or two for sure, because every girl who has bigger legs who's not in shape thinks that they can do wellness, and it's not really the look. Like it's just you have muscular, dense legs that are in shape. They're just a lot bigger than your upper body. So it's almost like a disproportional look, right? Like that's literally what it looks like in comparison to say like figure, your legs are big, but your upper body is also big. And with bikini, you're trying to match them, as well. So it's going to be interesting. I have a client who's going to be perfect for it, so I'm ready for her to do it. But besides that, it's not an easy division unless you have that kind of body type.
Yeah, the thing with it for me is like, yeah, the wording of it and calling it wellness, like the whole idea of wellness is about being globally well and in a healthy spot mentally, physically, holistically. And the whole reason why bodybuilding is no longer physical culture and is no longer just a holistic growth thing is because it became competitive. Mm-hmm. As soon as you start competing in something, you're now chasing an external goal, regardless of how well you can regulate it for yourself. Mm-hmm. So the extreme irony of the idea of competing in wellness, it's just like, to me, like the worst aspect of the fitness industry. It's like, we have wellness, but we're going to see who can be the most well. And it's like, oh my God, you know? So, I'm gonna reserve my judgment and maybe say, hey, maybe this is just a language barrier thing.
I think
maybe it's gonna go great, but I'm not necessarily optimistic. Let's just say that.
All right.
And
fair.
Maybe that's a personal fault of mine.
No, I think as always you're very well balanced, reasoned, way to form opinions and judgments on things. You know, I'd say in general doing a very good job. And may I just note, by the way, that Eric, after winning, I don't know if you heard this, Laurin, but he won the 2019 River City Royal Rumble Classic bodybuilding.
Yeah, the Royal Rumble Conference.
Yeah, it's same thing. It was a battle, and he emerged victorious. But afterwards, where you said you're a firm believer, you know, you do a show, eat what you want, like have a little bit of balance. We all went out to eat, and Eric ordered something very sensible, which I heard is uncharacteristic of competitors in general. And that just shows his level of self-restraint. Now, his hand was shaking when I was eating the ice cream, and his hand was like, had a spoonful of veggies. He was just like this. He's like, hey, man, that's cool. It's like, you really...
As Brian Whitaker astutely pointed out, he was like, Omar, that's nothing to brag about. He was 2 weeks out from his next show. That's exactly what he should have been.
Oh, right.
And I was like, see, Brian gets
it.
Brian Whitaker gets it.
I heard that and I was like dying laughing because Brian is so...
He's like, that's what you do to be a champion. But not taking bodybuilding too far. Let me go present it at an economics conference with my PhD tenured position.
Exactly. Yeah, for him, it's like he's all the way in for bodybuilding, but bodybuilding's third on his priority list. So I'm like, I wonder... You have to be a great husband and father is all I'm saying, because like your hierarchy of things, if you put that much effort into bodybuilding, wow. And it's third on your list.
Yeah, I mean, talk about an A++ performance as a husband and father and professor, because you can't do much better than winning the Orton Cup and the WMBF Worlds in the same year. So Father of the Year, Husband of the Year, Economics Professor of the Year, Brian Whitaker, was not impressed with my restraint post-show. So therefore, neither am I, and I'm no longer satisfied with my physique. The diet starts tomorrow, folks.
I love how external validation, which we always say can be very precarious and a dangerous thing, did not affect you whatsoever in your choice to continue to compete. I am as your personal wellness coach. I don't know if you know this, Laurin, but I look after Eric as a human being. I'm proud of you.
Well, I appreciate that, and that's the only way I can assess whether I'm a good person is what you just told me.
Yeah, I'll continue to tell you what you are and how you're doing.
Could you do me a favor? I'm going to post that you said that on Instagram, and I need more than a like. I actually need you to repost it, and then I think I'll be able to sleep tonight.
That's a tough call. I'm going to have to give you a maybe on that one, Coach.
All right, so I might sleep tonight. So this is my wellness coach potentially encouraging my sleep or not. We'll see.
Well,
rolling the dice.
Well, let's go to an actual coach. Laurin, is there anything that you want to say in closing about what we talked about? We appreciate you being on Iron Culture, sharing your perspective, the research, your knowledge. We do say knowledge like that because I heard another Canadian says it like that, which is knowledge? Pitch it up? Is that what you're saying here?
No, I was just saying I'm pointing north because that's the general direction of Canada at all times.
Oh, yes. It
doesn't matter where you are. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you guys again for having me on, and I will be sure to post as soon as the paper is open access. Hopefully that doesn't take 87 more years, but you never know. It's academia. And then just in general, for anybody who's listening, whether you're a athlete yourself or you're just starting out or you are a coach, you have to be aware of both flexible and rigid restraint and understand how to blend both of them. And it's never an easy, straightforward process, and it may take some people a lot longer than others, and that's okay. And they might fail a lot, but that's okay. That is your job. I know we always talk about scope of practice, and of course, as a coach or a trainer, you're not a psychologist, but you can still work on people's behaviors. And I think that, you shouldn't shy away from that, because that's not necessarily, taking the place of a therapist. Of course, if somebody is going down a very negative route, that is when you have to step in and say, hey, I think this would work better in conjunction with a, licensed psychologist or psychiatrist. But do not be afraid to work on behavior changes with people, and it's going to look very different for all of your clients.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
And Laurin, where can people find you?
So if you spell my name right, you'll probably find me on most places. So it's Laurin Conlin.
Laurin.
Laurin. We're going up Canadian.
To Canada.
Yeah. I was supposed to go to Canada this year, and I'm not now, which I'm pretty sad. But in any case, so Laurin Conlin. So that's, Instagram, YouTube. We do have a Team Loco Fit Roundtable, which is a podcast with myself and the other 4 coaches. We do have a newsletter. It's on our website, so we just put out educational articles. So yeah, pretty much on any of those places you can find us. So teamlocofit.com. And yeah, we'll be there.
Awesome.
Nailed it. Well, I'm going to close out this episode. I feel armed and ready for body and wellness, and I just want to say I appreciate, Laurin, you being on. We will have that bandana showdown one day. There might be an individual between the three of us attempting to open up some sort of iron culture-like facility in the next year. So should that happen, I think a seminar in the Toronto area, that is the unofficial capital of Canada, would be a great idea. I will make sure definitely the link in the description on iTunes and on YouTube, everything that you just listed for those that want to check Laurin out. I want to say I appreciate every single iron culture enthusiast for listening to this episode. If you've ever fantasized about drowning a 4-year-old child in the English Channel, this has been your episode. So we fulfill all wishes, and I think the imprint of Hereditary still clearly looms large on Eric, and I am proud to have known that I traumatized him to that extent where his entire worldview has been reshaped forever. And with that being said, you can help us change the world forever by joining the Iron Cult, by leaving a rating review on iTunes. It does help us out. And if you're on YouTube, if you liked it, you could go ahead and like it. If you didn't like it, no hard feelings. We will find you and we will knock on your door and want to know why, because we want your validation. And if you leave a comment, we'll do our best to respond to them. Until next time, we'll catch everyone on that next episode every single Monday.